This is something that has been going on for actually over a decade, decades potentially in the UK. There are some reports which suggest that in as many as 50 towns and cities, there's been some form of coordinated grooming of young, white, working class children, mostly girls, not exclusively, by mostly Pakistani Muslim gangs who then use them for sex.
Once again, we're very honored to have my good friend Jonathan Sacerdoti on the Quad Interviews. Jonathan is a broadcaster, journalist, and incredible debater, it turns out, as well. Jonathan, welcome back to the Quad.
Thanks for having me. Great to be with you, Ian.
Jonathan, it seems like every time we speak, something huge is happening in the UK. And since we spoke, since you came on our show to debrief for us that incredible debate in Oxford, it seems like there's been a tailspin of news coming out of the UK of really bad jihadi behavior, but over the last few decades, that is only coming to light today. So maybe you could deep dive a little bit with our audiences, because we've been hearing the whole story of the grooming gangs of one town, one working class town in the UK, where there was systematic rape of young girls. And then we see that there was a cover-up. And now we see that it doesn't seem that anybody wants to unearth this. So maybe just, Jonathan, take us through what's actually going on in the UK. And of course, we've got the murder of those little girls in Southport. What's happening in the UK, and are people beginning to get fed up?
The connection between what they call the grooming gang story and the Southport murders is actually an important one. And I think you've hit on the right topic there, which is it's because of the element of it, which is to do with immigration and Islam. And it's a very complicated story. In fact, it's two very complicated stories, so it's worth unpacking a bit.
Please.
The issue first of the so-called grooming gangs, which would be better called grooming, rape and torture gangs, as well as murder, because this is something that has been going on for actually over a decade, decades potentially in the UK, in more than just one city, though Rotherham is well known now as part of this story. But there are some reports which suggest that in as many as 50 towns and cities, there's been some form of coordinated grooming of young, white, working class children, mostly girls, not exclusively, by mostly Pakistani Muslim gangs who then use them for sex.
Oh my.
Now, the story isn't new. And it's not quite true that it hasn't been covered by the media, though that is one of the things we hear a lot. There have been some in the media who covered this for many years and in some detail, but it certainly wasn't adequate. It's such a big scandal that you would have thought this would be one of those stories that everybody was talking about for many years. More importantly, that politicians and local politicians, national politicians, police,
Law enforcement, that's what I'm
law
saying.
enforcement would have dealt with.
If it was in the media, why did law enforcement not do something?
So the big scandal is not just that these girls have been horrifically abused, but that there was a massive cover-up. And the cover-up is really a case of the modern issue of sacrificing one cause for that of multiculturalism and political correctness. In this case, the fact that these young working class white girls were being raped and abused and tortured by mostly Pakistani, mostly Muslim men meant that many in power were afraid of criticizing it for what it was and drawing the conclusions about the culture and traditions and makeup of these groups in society because of multiculturalism. Just to recap, it's a sort of Blair era, late 90s concept of multiculturalism that said that small minority communities were not just welcome in the UK, but actually could continue to exist almost in isolation. So the obligations...
And breaking the law?
Well, that's unfortunately the terrible conclusion that it came to. The idea that you might not learn the language and you might not change your culture or traditions to fit in with your host nation and all of these sorts of things became so entrenched as a concept of liberal acceptance that there are now in the UK, as there are in many parts of Europe, pockets of society which don't really fully resemble the host nation that they're in. And that's a problem in many ways, but it's obviously a massive problem when you have something like the rape gangs.
But one thing is, Jonathan, and we're both Sephardi Jews who live in communities. One thing is to live in a community, to carry on your prayer rituals, your communal festivals. And another thing is to have rape gangs. I mean, there's a big difference. You look at the Hindu community in the UK from India. Multiculturalism can work as long as you keep the law. I mean, why is that such a foreign concept for multiculturalism? That's what I don't understand.
Well, it shouldn't be. And
It's like marrying more than one wife. You go to England, you can't marry more than one wife legally because monogamy is what is acceptable and it's what is the law. So how does this happen?
So I think monogamy is a good example. So if you're a faith or a culture that has a tradition of having more than one wife, Britain is at least quite firm on that. Only one wife is allowed in British law. However, there are features of some cultures and religions and groups which are so hideously unattractive, if they have got the influence of that group motivating them, that there is a reluctance to point it out for fear of being racist. And that's really what's happened here. I think the idea that there is any connection between the ethnicity or the nationality of the immigrant groups who carried out these horrible sexual abuses, criticizing it felt to some people racist. It's like the Manchester Arena bomber. In the inquiry and inquest afterwards, actually one of the security staff in the arena had said that they were suspicious about the bomber and the backpack, and they'd wanted to say something but hadn't done for fear of being racist. Now, the point is that if your fear of being racist stops you calling out an actual bomber in an arena full of young girls, or if your fear of being racist or politically incorrect stops you calling out mostly Pakistani grooming and rape gangs, then you know that you've got what I think Gad Sad calls suicidal empathy.
Absolutely.
You're so empathetic
Yeah.
and so sensitive to not criticizing another group, which generally comes from a good place, that you then won't criticize a group carrying out the most horrific abuse of the girls. Now, the interesting thing about this story is why it has come to such international attention at the moment. And that's been in large part thanks to Elon Musk, who is never an uncontroversial figure. And Elon Musk decided to pick up this cause, but he's done that by championing Tommy Robinson, who many will know about. Tommy Robinson is somebody who has a controversial past of his own, but has been a champion of the victims of this cause for many, many years. He made it one of the causes, partly because he is motivated by his opposition to Islam, and there is a connection to Islam and Islamic communities in this rape gang controversy. But Elon Musk decided to champion Tommy Robinson, who's currently in jail in the UK.
Which is ridiculous in itself because he's in jail for showing a documentary and exposing a name of a kid who beat up another kid. I mean, I saw the documentary. He's in jail for contempt of court, right?
Tommy Robinson's in jail because he broke the law. That is, I think, accepted. But his treatment in jail, the category of jail, those sorts of things is seen as far more aggressive and severe than they need to be for the crime that he's committed.
Yep.
That's a whole other conversation.
Meanwhile, rapists are going free.
Exactly. And I think this is the problem. Elon Musk championed Tommy Robinson, criticized Jess Phillips, who is the, I think, Equalities Minister, for not backing a national inquiry into the rape gangs. And as a result, a lot of the coverage became connected with those people. And it became a debate about should Elon Musk be interfering in British politics? Should Jess Phillips be put in prison, as he said? Should Keir Starmer, who was the director of public prosecutions back in the day, before he was the Prime Minister, should he bear some responsibility for the lack of proper response from the authorities to these rape gangs in the past? All of these things became the questions. And I think what we lost sight of was the victims. The victims still don't have justice in many parts. Many of these girls, just to explain, actually did go to the police or the authorities themselves and were turned away and sent back. In one case, one of them was thought of as being drunk. There was another case
victim blaming.
It was seen
never heard that before.
Consenting as if a child gave consent to this rape. All of these things show massive failings, and to date, I don't think there have been any people from the police or the authorities who have been called out, revealed, or imprisoned for their part in covering up what happened to these poor girls.
But what's going on now? I saw there was a vote in Parliament for an inquiry? What happened with that?
So 364 votes against and only 111 in favour of a national inquiry. So this became the news talking point, was whether or not there should be a national inquiry. The Labour Party, very against a national inquiry, and they whipped their members to voting against it. But the 111 doesn't even
Cover all the Tories.
all the Tories.
Why?
All reform. So this is very interesting. I think that Britain has other examples of paedophile cover-ups. And I think that a lot of the issues that this brings to the fore, this is a story not just of paedophilia or abuse or rape or murder. And people can look at some of the court cases that have happened and the evidence and transcripts just to understand how horrific some of the things happening were. I won't go into the details here, but it's worth reading about them. But there have been people throughout this period who knew and have covered things up for a variety of reasons associated with corruption at the very least. So I think there are MPs who are afraid now of an inquiry.
But Jonathan, from what I understood, it didn't pass the Parliament, but Labour introduced something else to do some type of an inquiry? Or nothing at all?
I'm not always a big fan of these national inquiries. Sometimes they go on for a very long time. And sometimes they're an exercise in kicking a can down the road and spending a lot of money. I do think that this probably deserves an inquiry because the Labour Party said that there had been the Casey review already and that this therefore covered it and that there was no need to open this all up again. But the Casey review was much more broad in its aims and it covered many more issues and it really barely mentioned Rotherham, for example, where, Rotherham had 1,400 victims, just to give you an example.
But you are the rapists run free.
And I think that while some have been tried,
they have.
The issue is that there are numerous other examples of this going on. We have Rotherham, which is in South Yorkshire. There's Rochdale, Greater Manchester, Telford, West Mercia, which is near Wales. These are big issues, big cases where there is still the feeling that nobody's got to the bottom of this. And to tie it into the other thing that you mentioned, which was this murder of the little girls who were at a Taylor Swift themed dance party. What's bothered people here is that when the general public have in some way felt that there was a connection to immigration, illegal immigration, multiculturalism or Islam, and they have in some way used their voice to call it out, the authorities have stopped them. And we look back to what happened with the murder of those little girls. At the time, there was a big reaction and there were riots, effectively, because people felt that the truth was being hidden from them. At the time...
They didn't even mention the name of the murderer because it sounded foreign, right?
Well, initially they said there was a rumour that went around online that he was an immigrant. So we were told he wasn't an immigrant. He was Welsh born. His parents were immigrants. This in itself might not be the issue, but all sorts of things about it were hidden, whether it was a terrorist incident, whether it was motivated by ideological influences such as Islam. And we were told that none of this was correct. The government and the police swung into action and the judiciary to put people in prison within 24 to 48 hours for their inflammatory behaviour in reaction to it. In the meantime,
online for
online
tweets.
comments and
People are in jail for tweets.
Indeed,
unbelievable.
And I'll say this: maybe some of them deserve to be, but what came out of this was the concept of two-tier policing. And the nickname for Keir Starmer, two-tier Keir. And the reason is that people said, well, by all means do that if you think that's justified, but why not use the same swift action, the same decisive action to put down these other issues where actually we can see that you don't do that because for decades, little girls have been raped or similar issues like that have happened. And what we did find out about the murderer is that he, in the end, we were told, had an Al-Qaeda manual in his home.
Of course.
Numerous bladed items and knives. He had ricin, which he had made himself in the home. And so all of these rumors that there may be some connection to Islamic fundamentalism, that there may be some terrorist influence, were actually potentially correct. And in the end, this has come back to the media now because all of this was hushed up because they said it could compromise the court case. But he then did come back to court and finally pleaded guilty to this. And so a lot of this then came out into the public. Now, the problem remains that there is the perception among many people in the UK that things are hidden from them because there is the assumption that most ordinary people are just too stupid to know how to react, that somehow if they were told the truth about the rape gangs, if they were told the truth about the murders, they would react so violently against all Muslims, or that they would do something which is somehow more problematic than the original crime. And Keir Starmer said that the people who were calling for a national inquiry into the rape gangs, including Elon Musk, were actually jumping on the bandwagon of the far right. This has become his
Anybody
bogeyman.
normal now is a far right. Anybody who wants a peaceful society and not have jihadi values ruining their lives is far right. Is that true?
It seems to be. And the idea that there is this massive threat from the far right isn't one that we should dismiss, because obviously any threat from the far right is serious. But there is no real organised political far right in the UK, and there hasn't been for many years. And it's not good enough to simply say that anybody who has critical views of Islam or critical views of rape gangs or problematic problems with mass illegal immigration, none of these people are inherently far right just by virtue of that.
Or even love their country, Jonathan. People can't even say they love their country anymore. They're considered far right. It's ridiculous.
Patriotism is something that Brits wear very uncomfortably. I think that's true. And I think,
Well,
waving the flag is often, in many contexts, seen as a sign of racism or unacceptable nationalism. I agree.
it's okay to walk around with Hamas flags down Trafalgar Square. It's ridiculous.
And people who will wave, for example, the Palestinian or PLO flag in the streets of London somehow aren't seen as
No.
problematic or extreme, but people who will wave the flag of Great Britain or the United Kingdom are seen as problematic in many contexts. I think it is a problem. And I think that Britain, for me, as somebody that is British, grew up in Britain, identify very much as a proud Brit, I think we have a problem because getting to my age, I don't recognise fully the values that I was brought up with, that I considered to be quintessentially British. They've been replaced, many of them, with very problematic thoughts about multiculturalism and excessive tolerance. Of course, I'm a tolerant person.
It's tolerance of intolerance,
That's
essentially.
it. And I think that tolerance of intolerance, tolerance of extremism
Yeah.
is a massive problem when that extremism is utterly intolerant
Yep.
towards us.
Towards us.
And it's the same debate that I have constantly in discussing any of the problematic ideas about Islam, for example. If we must talk about Islam, which we must, because if it is targeting me as a Jew or me as a Western person or me as a non-Muslim, and it is targeting me in any sector and in any part for death or punishment or any kind of ill treatment, then I have every right to criticize it. It doesn't mean that I don't know many Muslims who also utterly condemn
Absolutely.
that kind of extreme behavior.
Absolutely.
Ultimately, if there is a central part of an ethos or philosophy or ideology, whether or not it's a religion, whether or not it's someone else's minority religion, I must be allowed to criticize it.
So, Jonathan, where does Britain go from here? The last time you were here, maybe it was the time before, I said to you, is it a lost cause? And you said to me, we're at the point, we're at that juncture that they can do something about it now and bring the country back from the brink, or we could really tailspin. So where are we now?
So I picked up my phone because there's something I saw in the Times today, actually, which I thought was worth mentioning. And before I get to it, I'll say I still believe that Britain could, like much of the West, make up lost time and recover what we need to. But I think that it's going to be a very tough battle. And I think that it requires many people to not just wake up, but also to speak up.
Take action.
Exactly. And I think that there is an understandable reluctance in our society to be outspoken in a way that seems critical of others, especially minority groups. It's very much against what many of us were brought up to do, especially Jews. We know we have a history of persecution as a minority religious and ethnic group. We know just how dreadful it can be when there is prejudice and unjustified criticism and punishment of us. But we can't use that as a reason to never criticize other minority groups when they are doing something deeply wrong or have problematic beliefs which are so deeply and fundamentally held that they are going to be damaging even existentially for our society. And this thing that I saw in the Times is this article about a Channel 4 program coming up where they did some polling. One always has to be careful with polls, but this polling found that 52% of Gen Z or Gen Z, I'm not sure how we say it. I will stick with Gen Z as a Brit.
Okay.
52% of 13 to 27-year-olds in the UK said they thought the UK would be a better place if a strong leader was in charge who does not have to bother with parliament and elections. So effectively a dictatorship.
Wow.
This to me is utterly, utterly terrible, because even if this polling is a little bit dodgy, a little bit inaccurate,
Skewed or whatever.
skewed in some way, if it points to a truth, we have a big problem. If 47% agreed that the entire way our society is organized must be radically changed through revolution. Now, we're talking about children, a lot of these people, so I will forgive 13, 14, 15-year-olds for having extreme or radical opinions that they may be working through before they become adults. But just to put on the table as well that our Labour Party toys frequently with the idea of giving 16-year-olds the vote, which is worrying when you hear things like that. 16-year-olds are still children. And I think that that's a problem. I think that some of the issues that generation are reacting to are very real. The other data in that poll shows issues to do with radical feminism having made many men feel overtly persecuted, emasculated. There are issues there which are at the bottom of this.
Talk about,
But I think that what's terrifying is the reaction, is that generation may feel that the right reaction is extremism of their own in the other direction. And I think that's the difficult thing for us to deal with today. And that's the challenge that Britain and the West, and all of us really, will have, is to decide how do we react to these fundamental problems. And if we react to fundamentalism with more fundamentalism, I think we're doomed. So it's never sexy to sell moderation. But what we need to go for is the middle ground in some respect, but not so much so that we have what Gad Saad calls this suicidal empathy. We need to stand up very firmly and stridently for what's right and wrong, but we also need to be calm, we need to be reasoned, we need to make our case boldly without being overtly or unnecessarily aggressive where it's not necessary. And I think this is a balance which we're finding more and more difficult today, partly through the influence of algorithmic thinking and influencing, and partly through the need to make your voice heard in extreme ways. But I do believe that that's going to be the ongoing challenge for all of us.
I completely agree. And I think that's that huge movement towards the extremes is a global problem. And just to wrap up, how do you see the Trump administration moving Britain in any way? If you think it'll have an influence, will help in any way, what do you think about that? How's it been received?
I think often Britain still has this belief that it's a much bigger influence in the world than it is.
Yeah.
And to some extent, that's quite a good thing at times, because if we just look at the last 15 months of what's been going on here in Israel and the Middle East, some of the noises from this government and even the last have not been great. And it's probably a good thing that they didn't have as much influence as they would have liked. That said, the flip side of that is that Britain will be led in part by what Trump and the Trump administration do. And I think that's also a good thing. If Trump can provide a sort of autocorrect or reset for America, that will by definition bring the rest of the world with him. But I don't think it's going to be an easy ride. I don't think it's going to be an easy ride for anyone, the next 4 years of Trump, much as many people, especially here, have breathed a sigh of relief. There's so many unknowns about him.
Absolutely.
Even how he will act in terms of the Middle East, in terms of Iran, is very unknown. If we have what Nadav Eyal, I saw in London just a couple of days ago, called a Singapore moment. Many of us have talked about this idea that Trump went to Singapore, met with the North Korean leader, and then came home and said, everything's fine, job done. But they still have nuclear weapons. So if we see a similar approach to Iran, I think we could well be in trouble, even with Trump in the White House, because the idea that you could have a photo op with the Iranian leadership, the Islamic revolutionary leadership, and somehow make good with them, but allow them to still develop nuclear weapons would be a problem. So in the same respect, I think Trump is unknown in almost every regard, but the guy has reset some normality and sense and decency, as far as I can see. And that sounds weird to some people, putting Trump and decency in the same sentence, but I don't think it is at all.
Well, I agree with you. I think the signs are good. We pray that will bring a little bit more stability to our region and give us all the backing it needs to get rid of the jihadists that we have over here. Jonathan, thank you for being that same voice from the UK. And thank you for being on the show.